Hey everyone, welcome back. This is video number 2, part 2 in the series of editing the tracked images, both single and panos. In this particular video, we're going to take a look at prepping the pieces that you have for blending in Photoshop, and then beginning the basic edits. So to jump in, if you watched the last video, we stitched together the panos for the foreground and sky utilizing this image here. And as I mentioned, it's a bit more complicated than I want to use for the primary demo for this, but there's going to be a couple pieces from this that I take a look at. But primarily, we're going to be switching over to a simpler image for the sake of demonstration. So in this one here, I've got just two pieces. One is the tracked sky, and the other is the foreground element. So here's the tracked sky that you can see. The foreground on this is obviously blurred because of the tracker, and then the foreground piece is this image here. Now, before some of you call me out on this, yes, the stars are sharp in this image. And the reason why is this is actually the result of stacking multiple single exposures for the sake of giving me a foreground piece to work with, which you certainly can do, but there's two reasons for that. One, I didn't have time to do a long exposure for the foreground at this location. But two, I wanted to demonstrate just a little bit more of what can be done with stacked foreground, as well as intentionally having a foreground that is shot at different exposure, which is opposite of what I typically recommend when shooting tracked sky and foreground, which is to keep both of those exposure values the same, whereas here they are slightly different, which will just give me a little bit more to demonstrate. So jumping right into this, the first thing that I want to do is just prep this image with some basic adjustments, as well as applying some noise reduction to it before we get too far into the edits. So what I'm going to do is start with the darker of the two images, which is my tracked sky, and then apply those, make those edits, and sync that across to both. So as is common in a lot of my Milky Way editing, what I'm going to do is, we'll reset this back to what it was, just so you can see where we started. Now, this was shot with an Astro modified camera, which is why we pick up this really red hue to it. So I am actually going to just adjust the white balance on this to get this back to neutral, utilizing the same techniques that I have shown before with increasing vibrance and saturation to 100 and then adjusting these balances here until we get a nice even blend of the two. Reset that back and we should have a pretty neutralized image. And I will do the same for the foreground piece. Now, if these were shot with the same exposure values, the same settings, same everything, instead of a stacked piece like I've got, you wouldn't need to do these independently, but since they are, I want to make sure that we end up with the same or at least very similar white balance on both. So I'm just going to go ahead and adjust the exposure value and the white balance manually just a little bit to get these the same. Now, you likely don't have to worry about this, but I want to make sure we've got a representative piece for this demonstration. Okay, so coming back to first my tracked sky. Like I said, I want to apply some basic edits to this image, and then we'll sync that across to the other. So what I typically am going to do is pull the highlights down, increase the shadows just a little bit, the whites just a tiny bit for now. We're going to leave texture, clarity, dehaze, vibrance, saturation, leave all of that alone. And then the other thing, couple other things that I want to check is I want to make sure that there's no sharpening applied yet. I'm going to turn that down. The noise reduction we'll come back to. And then the lens correction, it's okay if you want to have the chromatic aberration and the profile correction set up, but I do always recommend just turning off the distortion value on that to avoid any sort of issues with stretching stars and so on and so forth. So we'll apply that, and then I'm going to select the other one. I'm going to sync the same edits across to it. Now, if these are the same exposure value, you can just apply the same edit, all of the edits to the other image. But in my case, since they're not, all I'm going to want to do is not apply the exposure value or white balance to it, since those are slightly different from one to the next, and then just synchronize. Now I'll come back and deal with a little bit of noise reduction to start. And when doing that, I think it's important to have the view at least at 100% or further to see what kind of effect you're having on the quality of your image. So I'm going to apply a little bit of luminance noise reduction just until I get rid of some of the speckling, the noise that's throughout here. And then the color, the default around 25 is usually fine for that. And then I will, once again, sync that over to the other image. So I'm going to check none, just turn on the noise reduction settings here, including sharpening since we turned that off, and synchronize. Okay, so now we have both pieces of our image generally prepped and ready to blend in Photoshop. So to do so, what I'm going to do is select both of these images, right-click, choose Edit In, and then Open as Layers in Photoshop. And then that will automatically bring both of these pieces together as separate layers, as the tool implies, separate layers in Photoshop. And then to keep things clean, I usually like to just rename these files, rename the layers. Now I already renamed the files, so it does show that here, but it just helps keep things clean and easy to follow as things get more complicated. So I'll call that one Foreground, and I'll call this one Sky. Okay. And then the first thing that we need to do to prep these is select both layers. We'll go into Edit, Auto Align Layers. And with the auto projection selected, it should automatically align these layers quite well so that the foreground elements generally overlap one another. So when that's done, I'll typically just take this layer, turn that on and off, and you see it aligned the sky more than anything. In this case, it's probably because I had it a stacked sky that was nice and clean as opposed to a blurred one for the foreground. So it didn't do it to the foreground itself, but that's fine. Same things will apply. It's just a good habit to get into to align these, albeit not entirely necessary. Okay, so to get these ready for our editing, all I'm really aiming to do is to mask out the sky from the foreground layer so that my tracked sky, which is currently sitting underneath it, can show through. And the two ultimately will end up looking seamless. Now, there's a number of different techniques we can employ for this. The simplest of which is to utilize the sky replacement option. So if I select my foreground layer here, I'm going to go up to Edit, Sky Replacement. And typically the default settings are okay for this if it's going to work. So you see it automatically gave me a preview of this default sky, put everything onto new layers. I'm going to hit OK and just see the result. Now, why I like this, and you may have seen this in another video, is it automatically creates the starting point of a mask called sky. So all I really need to do here is to take that mask that it created, click and drag it down to my foreground. We'll leave that there. We'll select this sky replacement group that it created and delete it. We don't need that anymore. So we'll delete group and contents. That's gone. Now, if I turn off my sky layer, you see that it replaced the sky, but it's the opposite. So to make that actually remove the sky area, I just need to have this mask selected, being careful to click the mask itself, not just the layer. You can see how that changes the selection in the thumbnails. So with that selected, I'm going to hit Command I to invert that. And now you see it leaves only the foreground layer revealed, the sky layer still underneath. When I enable that visibility, now we see our tracked sky underneath the foreground layer. If you have a very simple foreground, a simple horizon line, everything's nice and clean, you don't have complication of all these trees, this can be a really simple, quick way to get this done, and usually it's good enough for it to work. Now if I zoom in on this and I start to look, you see a couple little issues. You see this blurred tree still showing through. If I get really picky about this, I can probably find some areas where the blending is a little bit off, like here the transparency isn't quite right for this. But again, because I had the same exposure value on these images, this is really quite believable, even if I have some see-through. Now, you do want to watch out for any like trailed stars that it had missed in this mask. But in this case, this is pretty darn good. And so what I could do as a very simple way to deal with these trees that are sticking out from my tracked sky, where they're blurred like that, is to simply take the sky layer and just pull it down below that horizon line until those are hidden behind the other piece. And that's it. We've got our two pieces roughly blended together. Now let me undo that, and then we're going to delete this mask and talk about a couple other ways to do this. Another option to mask out the foreground is to utilize various techniques for manually masking this out. Now you might look at this and immediately realize that's going to be an absolutely horrible process. When we have some of these detailed trees and all these leaves and branches and pine needles and everything sticking out. But it's worth considering, again, if you've got a simple foreground line that might just be a flat field or over the water or something easy, this is quick. So to do it, I'm just going to have my foreground layer selected. I'm going to go down here to add a layer mask to it. Puts a blank mask in. And then more often than not, your brush tool is going to be the one that you utilize for this. I'm going to reset this back to just a standard brush. And all you're doing is just going in and drawing the mask in black over the areas that you want to remove. So you see, if I go over this, I'm removing the foreground. You can do this either way. You can remove the sky, you can remove the foreground, however your brain interprets this correctly. For me, I like to remove the piece that I'm working on, remove the foreground, and then just invert that again later. But you can imagine how tedious this would be to come in here and isolate these trees, get all of this stuff perfect. Through a combination of tools, you can use a magic wand selection, you can use a lasso tool selection to start working on pieces to clean that out. But in this case, I really, really don't recommend it. However, if it was the flat horizon, you could very easily take your brush. Let's make this a little bit bigger and just pretend that this is a nice flat horizon. I'll change my hardness from really feathered to somewhere between 90 and 100, maybe 92-ish, so it's not a perfectly hard line. And click in one spot, let go, hold shift, click on the other end of the horizon. It'll draw a nice straight-ish line to start, and then you just mask out the rest. You could also use a lasso tool to select a nice straight line if it is that precise. Then go back to your brush, mask this out. Really, any mark-making tools within Photoshop will allow you to generate a mask on a layer mask like this. Again, this is not the best choice for a detailed image like this, so let's look at two more options that function somewhat similarly. The first of which is to take your foreground layer. We're going to duplicate that layer, either Command or Control J, or click and drag this down onto the plus, or simply go into the menu and duplicate layer. And then what we're going to do is desaturate this layer into just black and white. So Command or Control U to bring up the hue saturation option. We'll desaturate that entirely and hit OK. Now what we're trying to do is ultimately achieve pure black and pure white in this image so that we can use that as a layer mask. And two of the most powerful ways to do that, powerful and simple ways to do that, is to utilize your burn and dodge tools and or your brush tool with the layer or the blending mode changed. And I'll demonstrate both of these. But first, I want to cheat a little bit and try to just separate the white and black values even further. So to do that, I'm going to adjust the levels first. So Command or Control L to bring that up. And I'm just going to pull the whites over to brighten that up. And I'm going to pull the blacks over to darken those up as a start. And I don't want to go so far that I start to crush some of these details, but I do want to try to just get as much contrast along this horizon line as I can. And that looks pretty good there. So we'll hit OK. And then, like I said, two different tools for doing this. One is burn and dodge. We'll start with that. So what I want to do is dodge the sky to increase those highlights. So I make sure I have my range set to highlights. Exposure, I typically keep around 20 or 30% just so it's not so aggressive an edit. It gives me a little bit more control over that. So we'll set that down a little bit. And all I need to do then is just start painting over this area. And you see, because I have the foreground already pretty dark, it's only affecting the highlights. Now just be careful as you do this. Every time I brush more over it, it has a stronger effect. But once I reach that point, I could accidentally start to affect the horizon or the foreground itself. If you look closely, you see the tree is starting to deteriorate a little bit. We want to avoid that. So I'll undo that. Okay. And get back to where we were. Now, in this case, that looks like that would work really quite well to do the entire thing with just the burn and dodge. So I will burn in the sky, and then opposite to that, dodge the sky, and then opposite, I will burn in the foreground, making sure I'm only affecting the shadows here. Again, I'll change my exposure to about 20%, increase my brush size, and then just the opposite, start brushing along that tree line to really burn in the blacks, where I have already affected the whites behind it. And I'm not worried about the stuff down here just yet. I can do that more quickly and easily later. So you would just go through, dodge the sky, burn the foreground until you have that nice separation of black and white. The other method for this is to utilize a brush tool. So I'll switch to my brush here. Again, I want to turn this flow down to 10 to 20%, whatever you feel comfortable with. I'll do 20 for this demo. And then the trick here is to change this blending mode from normal down to overlay. And what that will do is anywhere that I'm painting a white color, switch this down here, painting white, onto it, it will only affect the pixels that are 50% gray all the way up to pure white. It will not affect 50% gray down to black. So to demonstrate, if I paint this over, you start to see how it's a similar effect to the burn and dodge. I do find this one gives me a little bit more control overall in that I can flip back and forth really easily by just hitting the X key to switch my black and white colors here. So if I hit X and paint again, now I'm affecting the darks, X, back to white, I'm affecting the highlights. You probably saw right there though, the same thing I was talking about earlier, where you can very easily start to overdo and lose some of the foreground. If I keep hitting this same area with the white, watch that little tree just disappear. Definitely want to avoid that, so be gentle with it. That's one of the reasons putting this flow down is helpful. It helps you be less aggressive on that. I might even go down to 10% to retain some of these details. So again, we'll just work through this entire horizon line here, getting the details or the nice contrast of black and white in between all of these details. So I'm going to undo that entirely, get back to our basic layers here. I'm going to delete that copy that we made and demonstrate the last version of doing this. Now, to do so, we're going to flip over to the Channels tab and one by one, click through red, green, and blue independently. And the nice thing about this is I find more often than not on a Milky Way image like this, your blue channel is going to give you the best starting point the most easily. But let's take a peek. And what I'm looking for is the highest separation, the highest contrast between the foreground and the sky right from the start. So the red channel is okay. Green maybe a little bit better, but blue, you see how the foreground is already a lot darker and there's a semi-clean line above that. So I'm going to start with blue. And so similarly, duplicating layers, we're going to duplicate this channel. I'm going to drag that down onto the plus sign to make a new one. You could right click, choose duplicate, or from the menu up here, all the same thing. But when I have this copied, I'm going to just change the name of this to mask so I know what I'm dealing with, and then employ the exact same tools as I had before, but from a new starting point. So I'm going to start with the burn and dodge. We'll see how that looks. So we're going to go ahead and dodge the sky to start with to create a little bit more contrast there. Okay, so we'll just start to paint that in. Zoom in and make sure we're not affecting anything negatively. I do want to watch where the foreground starts to lighten up a little bit in these areas and not go too hard all at once on that. So we'll just brush in a little bit across, a little bit, and just continue on the whole way, flipping back and forth between the burn or the dodge for the sky and the burn for the foreground, right? In this case, I think that I'm going to have better results utilizing the overlay brush method, just because I'm going to have a lot more control in maintaining some of these details. So let's try that out. Again, I've got this set to overlay. I've got my brush here. I'm actually going to change the hardness down to a nice soft brush. I just find that easier to work with. And start with painting white into the sky area. Okay. And as I said before, this is a delicate balance of kind of flipping back and forth between affecting highlights and shadows to get a nice, clean mask going with this. So I'm going to go through this image, finalize this brushing here to generate my mask, and then pick up again and show you the next steps. Okay, and then for the black areas, I'm not quite as worried about the same kind of level of perfection here, but what I do want to pay attention to is areas where there's like here, where there's highlights hitting a tree that I don't want to see through. I definitely want to paint that through. Same thing here, but being mindful of the areas that you do want to see through. If we paint black on it, we're going to hide that. So just be careful with what you're choosing. And then down below that, we can do the same thing of just quickly cleaning that up with a selection tool. Grab that whole area. Nope. Black background, Option Delete to fill that quickly. And then we've generally got our mask sorted out. Clean up the top area in the white here. Sorry about the little video overlap and cut. Some of this is out of sequence, but same things will apply. So let me just get this cleaned up real quick and we'll continue from there. Okay, so again, I've got a few little areas where I do want to paint in manually some of that pure white just to blend these together. So we'll get that taken care of and then proceed with getting this mask applied to the layers and finish up this portion of the image edit. Okay, so we've got that ready. Now the last thing I need to do is actually apply this mask that we've duplicated from the color channel to the layer itself. So I'm going to go back to the RGB. We'll go back to our layers, select the foreground, and add a layer mask to it with this button down here. Now when we go back to our channels, we'll have both of those showing, the mask that we've created, and then the foreground mask layer that has nothing on it yet. But to apply that, I'm going to select first the mask layer that we created. I'm going to hit Control-Command-A to select the entire canvas, then Control-Command-C to copy it. I'm going to select my foreground mask layer with its visibility turned on, Control-Command-A to select all again, and then Control-Command-V to paste that. Now we've got the exact same mask elements that we've created applied as a layer mask itself. So now if we go back to our layers, we can see that is here. However, it has masked out the foreground instead of the sky, just like before. So all we need to do is select the layer mask itself by clicking that icon, hitting Control-Command-I to invert it, and now you see the sky is removed. And when we enable the sky layer below it, we have our tracked sky blended relatively seamlessly behind the foreground layer. Now, a couple little things we're going to have to clean up. You can see where some of these trees stick up above our foreground layer from the tracked sky, and they show up as blurry. We're going to talk about a couple different tools and methods for cleaning that up. The first of which, like we talked earlier, is to simply just tuck this sky layer further down behind and call it good. In this case, I might be able to get away with that. If you had a nice flat horizon line, something simple, you would get away with that. But it makes for a pretty lame demo. So we'll undo that, and then we'll talk about ways to fill this in. So first is to just kind of go along the edge here, identify the areas that are problematic, like this here. We've got more of the blurred tree sticking out. We've got a good chunk of it over here. And then looks like the rest of the image is relatively clean. So the most common method that I end up using for this is taking the lasso tool. I'll typically set a feather on here to a few pixels, maybe 5 pixels, so it's a slightly softened edge. And then simply just draw around the area. That's the problem. Making sure we have the sky layer selected. And then hit Option Delete, or sorry, not Option, that'll cause a problem. Shift Delete to bring up the fill option. We're going to choose Content Aware and hit OK. More often than not, that solves the problem. And then Command-D, Control-Command-D to deselect. Now, one thing I forgot to mention, since we're sticking with the theme of non-destructive editing, is to duplicate the sky layer so that we have something to go back to if we need it. You can either right-click, duplicate layer. you can choose duplicate layer from the little hamburger menu, or simply drag this layer onto the plus button down at the bottom and make a copy. So from here, that's where we'll continue to work. Another option for you, let's go back to another problem area, is to use clone stamping. Now, this one can work well, but you have to be very mindful of duplicating obvious stars or other elements in the sky, clouds, little bits of tree, whatever, that become repetitious and are a dead giveaway. But to do it, we're going to grab our clone stamp tool here, and then holding Option or Alt on a PC, we're going to select an area of the sky that we want to use as a source, the reference image. So we'll hold that, click that area. Now, when we bring our tool over it, we can see what it's going to fill in. And I just click and hold and brush that in to fill out that area. And in this case, because it's kind of hidden behind the trees, it didn't really matter that I duplicated some of the stars. You can't really tell. I might do the same thing here with that one. So I'll find another area, Option, Control, click, and then brush that in. And then finally, let's look at one other method that honestly isn't necessary for this, but I'll show it anyway. What I'm going to do is take my rectangular marquee tool up here and draw around the problem area with a pretty large area covering around it. Then, again, with that layer selected, I'm going to go up to my filter menu and choose liquefy. That'll bring up a whole host of tools, but what I'm trying to do is just take this top tool here, the forward warp tool, and I'm essentially pushing the problem out of the way. So adjust the brush size as needed, click and hold, and just gently push that problem down or in the direction necessary to hide it behind your foreground layer. Now do be aware that this stretches things. If I get too aggressive here, you can see how it just warps those stars and becomes really obvious. So finesse is important, a little bit at a time, and sometimes a bigger brush is going to make that less obvious as you're taken from different areas of the sky. But when you get that close, you hit OK, and we can see what it did. So now this is after, that's before, after, and before. It's pretty close actually in this one, so that might be okay, but being that I could probably do this better with either the clone stamp or the content aware fill, I'd rather avoid stretching these stars. So I'm going to undo that and then go back to our lasso tool, select that area as we did before, hold Shift, click and delete to choose content aware fill, and let's see what it does. Okay, in this case, it didn't work very great. It picked up other areas. So I'm going to, again, undo that. We'll deselect and just do the clone stamp to finish this little area. So I'll make my brush a little bit bigger, select an area over here, roughly the same color still, and then just brush that in, and that should be good. Okay, so with those finished up, now I usually do still like to take my sky layer and just drop it down just a hair, just to make sure that I have everything hidden nicely, any problems concealed. And we have our blended layers. And so from here, what I'll typically do is select all of my layers and then press Command Option Shift on a Mac or Control Alt Shift on a PC, Command Option Shift E to merge those all into one new layer. And then now this, I'm going to rename and call it blended or composited or whatever makes sense to you. Okay, we'll have that. Then we'll save this image and ultimately bring this back into Lightroom to continue some of our basic edits. So while this is saving, being that I opened these layers from Lightroom, if I just simply hit save, let that finish processing and go back to Lightroom, we should, sorry, I have this in collections, so you're not going to see it right away, but we will have that image back in Lightroom automatically. There's no need to re-import since we started from there. So again, with the color labeling, I'll typically take this image, I'll change its color label to something that I know I'm working with, which for me is yellow. Yellow is my working files. And now I've got this to work from. In the next video, we're going to go through some of the basic edits in Lightroom here to get this prepped to bring back into Photoshop for some further, more enhanced refinements of our final image. So check back for that video.